Welcome to Season 2 of Minding the Gap, Conversations on Gender. As global gender equality decreases, it is critical to share lessons as we work to turn the tide. From migration to sustainability and politics, we're exploring topics where gender is often overlooked, but inspiring stories emerge. You can listen to the entire series, including the first season, on all the major podcasting platforms, as well as our website at ECDPM.org.
We always focus on what makes us different rather than what makes us similar. And I think this is what's been cleverly achieved by those that want to disrupt, like creating this polarized, you're there, I'm here. When it's like, in essence, on a human level, we all want to live in comfort with our families, be happy, have food. That's what we want. I don't know how and when and how we will get there, but it cannot be like this.
Hello there. Welcome to another episode of Minding the Gap, Conversations on Gender. I'm Pauline Veron, and I'm a researcher at ECDPM, where I focus on EU foreign and development policy. 2024 is a key year in terms of elections, and from 6 to 9 June, around 400 million people will be eligible to choose the new representatives in the European Parliament. As polls show gains by right-wing parliamentary groups, and in the context of general backsliding on gender equality, I was curious on the one hand about the impact women voters could have on the result of the election, and on the other hand about what we can expect in terms of the potential impact of the European elections on gender equality. In today's episode, we will explore these issues with Angela Lowe, Senior Advisor at Women Political Leaders. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you so much, Pauline, for having me.
Can you tell us a bit more about yourself and your work?
So, as introduced, I'm Angela. I work with Women Political Leaders. Women Political Leaders is the global network of elected and appointed women parliamentarians, women ministers, women heads of state and government. The main aim or mission of WPL is to increase the number of women in political leadership positions, but also to increase their influence. And we do that by providing high-level events. We also do a lot of advocacy campaigns, and we do a lot of research. At the moment, one of the big bodies of research is called Representation Matters, and it's exactly showing, why we need more women in politics, but sort of making the business case for the fact that when there are more women in politics, positive policy changes happen for society.
So we're a few weeks away from the European elections. So how do you think that the vote of women could impact the results of the elections?
So I think women's voting is critical in influencing this election and shaping the future of gender equality policies in the European Parliament. As you mentioned, the rise of far-right parties poses a significant threat to women's rights. These parties seek to sort of undermine and eliminate or erode key rights, such as, non-discrimination legislation, but specifically we've seen, for example, their positions on things such as reproductive rights. In terms of the historical turnout rates, if you look at 2014, 45% of voters were men, compared to 41% of women. And in the 2019 elections, while the overall turnout increased to 50.1, I think, the gender gap in turnout narrowed slightly. And the approximately 52% of men with 49% of women, which is an improvement from 2014. So while women's participation in national elections has improved significantly, there still seems to be a slightly lower turnout rate for women compared to men in secondary ballots, like the European elections. And so it's difficult to, at this stage, say whether more women will turn out to vote in June, but it's clear that we need to be increasing and mobilizing women's participation, because that could change the electoral landscape in some countries, especially considering that historically women tend to be less attracted to far-right parties.
And indeed, so it's about encouraging them to go to vote and then mobilizing them in the few weeks that remain before the elections.
Exactly. And I think there is this message that needs to be highlighted in terms of including women in votes. Radical right parties or conservative parties have been doing a very good job in, modernizing their image. And so, people will sometimes say, oh, but what about the women that are voting for these parties, or the women that are in these leadership positions, which, let's be honest, are very few. It's more of a tokenistic approach, really, right? And I think there's something to be said for that in terms of, why or how these right-wing parties are being able to attract women despite their rejection of feminism. And I think it comes down to them sort of co-opting language of women's rights to advance their often anti-immigration agenda, or they will frame, division in terms of cultural clashes. So, when you look at their way of attracting women, I don't think it's in a genuine way. And I think it's also making usage of a very polarizing time, right? Where people are frustrated, people are experiencing living cost crises. So it's very easy to be able to capitalize on that. I think another thing that we need to also look at when thinking of voting rights for women is administrative exclusions, and also the topic of intersectionality, right? So we need to, for example, address barriers faced by marginalized groups, such as refugee women, in accessing the electoral process. Another aspect I had been thinking about as well was also increasing the representation of women and minority individuals in politics can empower marginalized communities and foster greater political participation and engagement. So when women and other minority groups see themselves represented in decision-making, they're more likely to feel valued, heard, and motivated to participate in democratic processes, such as going out to vote. Another threat to the right of vote is some undemocratic practices that exist. There's something called, for example, family voting, which happens a lot in certain European countries, which, undermines the autonomy and individual choice. In cases of group voting and open voting, women may face the pressure or get coerced from male relatives to vote according to their preferences rather than their own beliefs or interests. Things like proxy voting, where, male family members collect and mark ballot papers on behalf of women relatives. I think political parties, civil society organizations can also play a crucial role in advocating for gender-sensitive electoral reforms and promoting gender-balanced candidate lists, for example, to increase women's representation in elected office.
Very interesting. You're raising a lot of issues, and I see barriers at different levels, right? One is at the level of encouraging women to vote and to participate in elections, and then barriers in their political representations, right? And that's a sort of virtuous cycle where women political representation actually also encourages women to vote and to have positive models. I hear that's what you're saying, right?
Exactly. Because in the end, it's this cliche but very true phrase that's you can't be what you can't see. So when people don't see themselves represented, for them, they just don't feel that they're seen or can have an impact really if there are not candidates that represent, that first of all look like them or represent their interests and their worries. So I think it's something to be said in elections generally, and I think it's something to be taken a look at very closely, especially with the European elections, because of course we have the numbers of 39% of women, which is if you look back from 1979, which I think was like 15%, we've come a long way. I mean, it's taken 45 years, right?
Of women in...
the percentage of women in, for example, the European Parliament. But when we talk about women, I feel like sometimes we tend to think of women as this homogeneous group, right? So it's like, yes, we have more women. Yes, but within that, how many women from the LGBTQI plus community do you have? How many women from different backgrounds, race, sexual orientation, but also a lot of the times, for example, women with disabilities, which are, often overlooked as well. So I think it's important for us to ensure that when we talk about women, we talk about them in all their diversity.
Yeah, exactly. And to adopt an intersectional approach.
So you see, and this is the thing, like we always think of things as silos and not see how it's interconnected, even as people, right? That we're all, in the end, we're always focused on what makes us different rather than what makes us similar. And I think this is what's been cleverly achieved by those that want to disrupt, like creating this polarized, you're there, I'm here. When it's like, in essence, on a human level, we all want to live in comfort with our families, be happy, have food, have things, like, that's it. That's what we want. And I think I don't know how and when and how we will get there, but it cannot be like this. And I was hopeful that, like, okay, this is the first election after COVID. I was like, people, like, we saw, like, during that time what that meant and how much we needed solidarity and how much we can get done when we're all together, right?
All right. And I think you mentioned also economic concerns, which are high on the agenda for this European elections, and that might also explain why women vote more for right-wing or far-right parties at the moment. So, as I mentioned already, the next European Parliament, but also the leadership of the European Commission, are widely expected to be more right-leaning. What impact can we expect on women's rights and gender equality? You already mentioned a few, but what are your concerns on that front?
I mean, if we look back, right, in terms of the gender equality priorities or policies that have been put in place during this mandate, so 2019 to 2024, there's a lot of effort that has been placed on addressing disparities, including violence against women. There have been some excellent achievements so far. So we have, of course, the Women on Boards Directive, which took 10 years to get. The EU Directive to Combat Violence Against Women. We've seen the EU Pay Transparency Directive that covers pay transparency and pay equity. And we've also seen the ratification of the Istanbul Convention by 22 member states, although all 27 have signed. So this shows that, this has been kind of the legislative term where real impact has been created around the gender equality agenda. And I fear that if we were to inherit a more right-leaning parliament or European Commission, the impacts on gender would be catastrophic. We've seen that, the extreme right in the European Parliament has consistently opposed or abstained on reports related to gender-specific policies, such as the equal pay for equal work and other gender aspects, for example, of the energy crisis. We've seen how they support legislation that restricts access to reproductive rights, such as abortion or contraception. This could have significant implications for women's reproductive health and autonomy. In terms of family policies, right-leaning parties often advocate for this traditional family and values. And so there's this tendency for them to promote more traditional gender roles, like this going back to, quote unquote, what they call going back to tradition. And this could include, measures to incentivize women to stay at home as caregivers, not from choice, but just by, policy decisions that are taken that make it more attractive for them to stop their careers and potentially impacting women's economic empowerment and the workforce participation. I can go on and on and on. And I think what we need to keep in mind is having this awareness of the real risks posed by the extreme right. And I think it's crucial for individuals and advocacy groups to actively oppose the extreme right's efforts to undermine gender equality and advocate for policies that promote women's rights and gender equality in Europe.
Good reminder, a few weeks before the election. So thanks for that. And I think it shows that the next 5 years might be bumpy and we need to keep that in mind. At the same time, we also expect quite a few women to lead the EU institutions in the next cycle, including Ursula von der Leyen, who might remain president of the European Commission. What are your hopes in terms of women's political participation in the next European political cycle, knowing that?
I think despite these looming challenges and what might seem like a gloomy outlook, I think the importance of women's political participation cannot be overstated. And now more than ever, it's vital to champion and advocate and support, i.e. vote for more women in politics. One of the core values of the Union is equality. So that should really translate into equal representation in decision-making positions across EU institutions. I mean, Eurostat data shows that there are 5% more women than men in the EU. So I think the underrepresentation of women in these positions pose a serious democratic deficit within the EU. And, true democracy within the Union can all be achieved when the interests and needs of all citizens, including women, are adequately represented. And so, in this mandate, we've had, one woman president of the European Commission, the first ever. 13 out of 27 commissioners are women. That's obviously very good. We've had one woman president of the European Parliament, who is only the third. But then you see figures such as 6 out of 20 committee chairs are women. 4 out of 20 of the subcommittee chairs are women. And again, only 39.8% of MEPs are women. And if we're talking about right parties, conservative parties, coming out potentially third as a group, that very much might erode the gains given, because there's not many women represented in those parties. I think it's great to have these amazing women, at the top, but I think we shouldn't lose sight that, just having that one woman figurehead at the top of the pyramid is, of course, great, but also ensure that horizontal inclusion of women at different levels of the leadership ladder. Again, going back to some statistics, we see, for example, the FEM committee, the membership is about 91% women. So the FEM committee, Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality. But when you look at the Committee on Constitutional Affairs, it's 85% men, and the Committee on Budgets make up 75% men. And if we talk about gender equality being cross-cutting, these are committees that, decide funding.
Thanks for that. And you raised two issues that I want to follow up on. The first one is, you mentioned the fact that we need representation of women at all levels and in a balanced manner, meaning in different committees of the European Parliament. And it resonates with an issue that we've heard about at national level, where women hold positions in, they're ministers of social affairs or sectors that are considered as more soft, and less so of defense, foreign affairs, and finance, as you mentioned. So that's a key issue also, not just having numbers, but also balanced representation of women across issues and not just in sectors considered as soft.
Exactly. And I mean, going back again, because we've mentioned the threat, when you look at some of these parties from their national standpoints, right? Some of these countries where these parties are predicted to make the biggest gains, you'll see that there are hardly any women in those sort of ministerial, parliamentary roles of leadership that will translate to their positioning in the European Parliament. So this is, again, it's an issue, and I think it's something that needs to be addressed, because it's not like there are not enough qualified women. Right? There are many women that can become a Minister of Finance, a Minister of Foreign Affairs. And so I think we need to really pay attention to why it's not happening and how we can address that. Because indeed, it's not only about the numbers, but it's also about, again, the levels of influence and power that women in politics can access.
Yeah, exactly. And that comes back also to the issue of stereotypes that you mentioned already. Can you just say a few more words on what kind of stereotypes women face in politics?
So about stereotypes and biases, so there's a body of research called a Reykjavik Index for Leadership, and it looks at perceptions of people. It's in the G7 and plus Nordic countries, I think, of people's perceptions of women for leadership. And last year's findings were quite shocking. And it actually showed that there is this change where you'll see this trend of actually young men between 15 and 35 who are progressively, seeing women as less suitable, especially in politics, which is something that, people would think, oh, it's an older generation trait, but it's from the research carried out, it's their prejudice against women in leadership is higher than even those of their parents. So there seems to be a reversal of that. And in terms of what other stereotypes or the negative biases against women, it's again this sort of seeing women as being good, for example, for the household or in other what quote unquote soft industries, women in fashion, that's great. But a woman leading a country, I don't think so. So again, this is all based, it's kind of rooted in the patriarchal system where, there is this, and to be fair, we're seeing this, yes, this trend of young men, but there are also young women who have the same view of like, great, I wouldn't vote for a woman to run my country, but, if she wants to run a magazine, then great, but not politics. So I think it's still this perception that's rooted in patriarchal norms that, women just don't make good leaders, which is absolutely false because we've seen examples of that. And it's just, it's worrying.
Thanks a lot for these insights. Is there anything you'd like to add to finish this conversation?
So I think my closing message would be to voters. I'd say to everyone voting to think about why you're voting, right? What kind of Europe do you want for the future? Do you really want to protect and sustain the European project, which is a project of equality, inclusion, and solidarity? Or do you want the opposite? I would say, again, remember that representation matters and that diversity in leadership leads to more innovative solution and also better reflects our population. And to take the time to look into the parties and the candidates you want to vote for, their track record, because really it's about electing the right politicians who will ensure the kind of society we want to live for. And a special message to the women voters, political participation was a hard-fought right, so please use it.
That's a great message. Thanks a lot for that. And thanks a lot for sharing your insights throughout this conversation. I think we've addressed key issues. You've talked about the different barriers in terms of, encouraging women to go to vote, but also, once they vote, to vote for women that are progressive and that, represent their vision. And then also once women are elected, to make sure that there's also balanced representation at all levels. You mentioned the issue of horizontal inclusion. So those are quite key barriers that we still have to address. You've also mentioned the key risks and threats that far-right and right-wing parties generally might represent for gender equality and women's rights in the next few years. I think that's a good reminder a few weeks ahead of the European elections. But you've also mentioned some of the progress that has already been made in terms of women's political representation. And I think we need to also cling to that and then, keep making progress on that front. And that's partly key at a time where the EU's gender equality agenda is being challenged both internally and externally. So I think the stakes are quite high. So thanks a lot for raising those issues and sharing your insights with us. That's all for today. And thanks for listening. Until next time. Thanks, Angela.
Thank you so much, Pauline.